there is a napped flint wall, grey and white in the Sussex light, standing at the edge of a chalk down 5 miles north of Chichester. The flint was split by hand in the 18th century, each face shaped to catch the sun. The wall belongs to Goodwood House, the seat of the Dukes of Richmond. It has stood on this ridge of the South Downs since 1697, when Charles Lennox, the first Duke of Richmond, bought the property as a hunting lodge. He was 25 years old. He was the illegitimate son of King Charles II by his Catholic mistress Louise de Keroualle, Duchess of Portsmouth. He had been given a title, a pension, and a name his father could not legally pass to him. He needed a country house. He bought one. The house he bought was a modest brick lodge. The house that stands there now is something else. Matthew Brettingham rebuilt the core of it in the 1720s. Sir William Chambers added wings between 1747 and 1750. James Wyatt undertook the major reconstruction between 1800 and 1806, giving Goodwood the long, flint-faced flank that runs along the south front, the 3 corner towers that were intended to become 4, and the great staterooms that open one into the other along the principal floor. The 4th tower was never built. The money ran out. The asymmetry was left in place. It is still there. You can stand at the corner of the lawn and see where the 4th tower would have risen, and where instead the wall simply ends in a flat parapet, as though the architect had set down his pen mid-sentence. The Lennox family has owned Goodwood continuously since 1697, 327 years. 11 Dukes of Richmond. The current Duke, Charles Gordon Lennox, inherited in 2017. He was born in 1955. He lives in part of the house with his family. The state apartments are open to the public from March to October. The estate runs a hotel, a golf course, a motor circuit, a horse racing course, and an aerodrome. It employs more than 700 people. It turns over £56 million a year. It is, by some measures, the most commercially successful private estate in England. It is also one of the most scandal-stained. The Lennox family produced an eloped daughter in 1744, a near queen in 1761, a duellist who shot a button off a royal uniform in 1789, a duchess who held the ball before Waterloo, a Tobago plantation that was compensated under the Slavery Abolition Act, and a horse racing meet that began because the 3rd Duke had been banned from Newmarket for doping his horses. Every generation has produced a story the family would rather not tell, and a story the family has nonetheless preserved in letters, in account books, in the bedrooms where the events occurred, and in the boxes of papers now lodged in the British Library. This is the story of Goodwood House. It begins with a hunting lodge and a Catholic mistress. It runs through a king who wanted to marry a Lennox girl and was steered away from her by his own tutor. It runs through a ball in Brussels on the eve of Waterloo. It runs through 3 named servants whose lives were spent inside its walls. And it ends with a letter, still preserved in a London library, written by a 16-year-old girl on the afternoon she carried the new Queen's train at the coronation in Westminster Abbey. The first Duke of Richmond bought Goodwood because he wanted to hunt with the Charlton Hunt. The Charlton was the oldest documented hunt in England. It had been established in the second half of the 17th century by a group of Sussex gentlemen who had decided to pursue the fox rather than the deer, at a time when fox hunting was still considered a rough country pastime fit only for yeomen and farmers. The Charlton met in the woods above Singleton, 4 miles from the house, on ground that rises sharply from the chalk down toward the beech hangers of the High Weald. The first Duke joined the hunt in 1696, having been introduced to it by his cousin, the Earl of Burlington, who had a house at nearby Selsey. He bought Goodwood the next year. The hunt was the reason for the house, and the house, for the first 30 years of its existence, was little more than a place to sleep between days in the field. The first Duke kept a pack of 45 couple of hounds in the kennels at Charlton, and rode out 3 days a week between October and March. He maintained the kennels at his own expense, paid the wages of 3 huntsmen and 2 whippers-in, and entertained the gentlemen of the hunt at his table after every meet. The Charlton Hunt records, preserved in the Goodwood Estate Archive, show that the first Duke spent more on the hunt in any given year than he spent on the upkeep of the house. He was not, by the standards of his half-brothers, a wealthy man. His pension from the crown was £3,000 a year. His income from his Sussex estates added perhaps another £2,000. He was rich enough to live like a duke. He was not rich enough to live like the brother of a king. He chose to spend his money on his hounds. The first duke died at the lodge in 1723. He was 51. He left the property to his son. He also left a set of stable accounts kept in his own handwriting that record the name of every horse and every hound on the estate at his death. The accounts are still in the estate archive. They have been consulted by perhaps a dozen scholars in 3 centuries. The second Duke of Richmond inherited Goodwood at the age of 22. He was a serious man, a fellow of the Royal Society, a collector of paintings and natural specimens, and the husband of a woman he had been forced to marry at the age of 18 in order to pay off his father's gambling debts. The marriage, arranged in 1719 at The Hague, paired the second Duke with Sarah Cadogan, daughter of the first Earl Cadogan. The bride was 13. The groom did not see her again for 3 years. When he returned and met her properly, he found her grown into a woman he liked. The marriage became one of the great love matches of the early 18th century. They had 12 children. 7 survived. The eldest was Lady Caroline Lennox, born in 1723. The youngest of the surviving daughters was Lady Sarah Lennox, born in 1745. It is Caroline who produced the first Goodwood scandal. In 1744, at the age of 21, she eloped with Henry Fox, a politician 20 years her senior, who would later become the first Baron Holland and the father of the great Whig statesman Charles James Fox. Fox was clever, ambitious, and considered by the second Duke to be entirely beneath his eldest daughter. The Duke had refused permission for the match. He had told Caroline that if she persisted, he would cut off her allowance and remove her from his will. Caroline had answered that she would marry Fox regardless. The Duke had warned Fox in writing that any approach to his daughter would be treated as an affront to the family. Fox had read the warning and ignored it. Caroline and Fox married in secret on the 2nd of May 1744 at the chapel in Mayfair, where so many of the 18th century clandestine marriages were performed. The Mayfair chapel had no license requirement and a chaplain who would marry any couple for a fee of 1 guinea. The marriage was reported in the London newspapers within a week. The second Duke read of his eldest daughter's marriage in the Daily Advertiser. He broke off all contact with his daughter. He refused to see her. He refused to see her husband. He refused to receive their children. The breach lasted 4 years. What is remarkable about the 1744 elopement is not the elopement itself, but its consequence inside the Lennox family. The second Duke did not merely cut Caroline off. He instituted, across all of his remaining children, a set of rules about marriage that bordered on the legalistic. He drew up a list of suitable husbands for each of his daughters. He required that any letter from a potential suitor be addressed first to him. He forbade his daughters to travel to London without a chaperone of his choosing. The Duchess, who had herself been married off as a child to a man she had not chosen, regarded the restrictions as oppressive. She wrote in a letter to her sister-in-law that her husband had become afraid of his own family. The breach with Caroline was eventually mended by the Duchess, who could not bear to be estranged from her own grandchild. She forced a reconciliation in 1748 by simply appearing at Holland House with the second Duke in her carriage, having told him only that they were going for an afternoon drive. Henry Fox, who had been warned, met them at the door. The 2 men shook hands without speaking. The Duke kissed his grandson. The breach was mended, but the principle had been established in the Lennox family that a daughter who married against her father's wishes could expect silence in return. The principle would be tested again, more spectacularly, by Caroline's youngest sister. Lady Sarah Lennox was born on the 14th of February 1745. She was the youngest of the surviving Lennox daughters. Her mother died when she was 6. Her father died when she was 5. She was raised partly by her elder sister Caroline at Holland House in Kensington and partly by her aunt in Dublin. When she returned to England in 1759, at the age of 14, she was placed in the care of her brother, the third Duke of Richmond, and in the household of her sister Caroline and Caroline's husband Henry Fox. She was very pretty. She was very clever. She had been raised inside one of the great political households of the age, and in February 1761, when she was just turned 16, she rode out in Holland Park one morning, and the new King of England saw her. George III had ascended the throne in October 1760. He was 22 years old. He was unmarried. He was, by the standards of his Hanoverian family, an unusually serious young man, deeply religious, devoted to his mother, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, and dominated almost entirely by his former tutor, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute. Bute had been the king's governor since he was a boy. Bute was now the king's first minister in all but title. Bute had views on whom the king should marry, and those views did not include Lady Sarah Lennox, but the king had seen her. In February 1761, he rode past Holland Park and saw Sarah on horseback in the morning light. He returned the next morning. He returned the morning after that. He arranged, through Lady Susan Fox Strangways, Sarah's closest friend and a young woman attached to the court, to send Sarah a message. The message, preserved in Henry Fox's papers in the British Library under the reference Additional Manuscript 51428, was written in the king's own hand in March 1761. It read, "I am sure you may guess by my behaviour to a certain young lady that she should be the one I wish to marry." The note was not addressed directly to Sarah. It was addressed to Lady Susan. It was meant to be shown to Sarah. It was meant to be passed by Sarah to her brother-in-law Henry Fox, and Henry Fox understood at once what he was being given. He was being given a possible Queen of England. The Foxes were a clever political family with a daughter of the Duke of Richmond living in their house. If Sarah married the king, the Foxes would be the first family in England within a year. Henry Fox began to plan. He instructed Sarah on how to behave. He arranged for her to be seen at court. He encouraged her to accept the king's attentions without committing to anything that could be retracted. He briefed his wife Caroline. He briefed Sarah's brother, the 3rd Duke of Richmond, who was at this point still finding his feet in his title. The 3rd Duke, by all accounts, was delighted. A Lennox queen would erase, in a single coronation, every memory of the family's bastard origins. It would make the granddaughter of King Charles II's Catholic mistress the official mother of the next generation of the House of Hanover. Henry Fox steered Sarah toward the court. The 3rd Duke supported him. Caroline was uneasy, but did not intervene. Sarah was 16. For 3 months in the spring of 1761, the king wrote to Sarah. He danced with her at court balls. He sought her out at receptions. He was, by the testimony of everyone who saw him in those weeks, infatuated. And then in June, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, confronted him. What Bute said to the king in June 1761 is not preserved verbatim. The substance of the conversation has been reconstructed from Bute's letters, from Princess Augusta's diary entries of that month, and from a later account written by Horace Walpole. The substance was this: the king could not marry an Englishwoman. The king could not marry a Catholic, or the granddaughter of a Catholic. The king could not marry the niece of a politician whose ambitions were already being whispered about in every embassy in Europe. The king had to marry a German princess. The king had to marry the woman the king's mother had already chosen, and the king's mother had already chosen. Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, the king's widowed mother, had been working on the marriage for months. She had identified Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg Strelitz, a quiet, pious, plain young woman from a minor German principality, as the ideal queen. Charlotte was Protestant. Charlotte was foreign. Charlotte was without political connections in England. Charlotte was, in Augusta's view, exactly the kind of wife who would not interfere with the existing arrangements of the court. Augusta hated the Lennoxes. She had hated them since their father's death. She regarded them as Whig grandees who would, through Sarah, take over her son's household. She told Bute to put a stop to it. Bute did. On the 8th of July, 1761, the king's engagement to Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg Strelitz was announced. Sarah read the news in a London newspaper. She had not been warned. She had not been told. The man who had been writing to her in March, who had been seeking her out in May, who had told her in his own handwriting that she was the one he wished to marry, had become engaged to another woman without sending her a single line of explanation. Henry Fox, when he heard the news, wrote in his diary on the 9th of July, 1761, an entry preserved in the British Library under additional manuscript 51388. The lad has done as Bute told him. There is nothing more we can do. What followed was, by the standards of any age, an act of cruelty masquerading as a court honour. The new queen was to be crowned alongside the king on the 22nd of September 1761. The Queen's train, by tradition, was carried at the coronation by the daughters of the highest nobility. Lady Sarah Lennox was selected as one of the train bearers. She could not refuse. To refuse would have been an open insult to the new Queen, and a public confirmation that there had been an attachment between Sarah and the king, that the marriage to Charlotte had broken off. The third Duke of Richmond, her brother, instructed her to accept. Henry Fox, who had pushed her into the king's path and had failed to push her into his bed before the engagement could be undone, instructed her to accept. Caroline begged her to accept. Sarah accepted. On the 22nd of September 1761, Lady Sarah Lennox, aged 16, walked down the nave of Westminster Abbey behind Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg Strelitz, holding the corner of the new Queen's train. The king sat on the throne. He watched the procession. By the testimony of 3 observers present that day, he could not bring himself to look at Sarah as she passed. Sarah, by the same testimony, did not look at him. She held the train. She walked the length of the nave. She knelt in her place during the ceremony. She walked back. She rode in the procession to Westminster Hall. She attended the coronation banquet. She returned that night to Holland House. The next afternoon, the 24th of September 1761, she sat down and wrote a letter to her friend, Lady Susan Fox Strangways. The letter is preserved in the Holland papers in the British Library. The relevant passage reads, "I bore yesterday well enough. It is over. I shall not see him again. She was 16. She had walked behind the woman who had replaced her. She had been used by her brother, by her brother-in-law, by her aunt, and by the king himself. She had survived a public humiliation that would have broken many women 3 times her age, and she had written, in 5 short sentences to her closest friend, the most quietly devastating account of a royal love affair that the 18th century produced. She did see him again, of course. She lived another 65 years. She was at court many times during George III's long reign, but she never wrote to him. He never wrote to her. The correspondence that had passed between Holland House and St. James's Palace in the spring of 1761 was sealed up by Henry Fox, kept in the Holland papers, and is now in the British Library in a box in a room the public cannot enter without an appointment. There is one further detail of the September 1761 coronation that has been preserved by the descendants of Lady Susan Fox Strangways, and that deserves to be set down. Lady Susan, who had carried the king's first note to Sarah in March 1761, had been promised by Sarah that whatever happened, she would not be cast aside as a confidant. Lady Susan was 18 years old. She had been at court since the age of 16. She was a clever, quick-tempered young woman of independent fortune, and she had developed during the spring of 1761 a romantic attachment of her own. The object of her attachment was William O'Brien, an Irish actor at Drury Lane Theatre. The attachment was as impossible, by the standards of the age, as Sarah's attachment to the king. An earl's daughter could not marry an actor. Lady Susan was warned. She was begged. She was threatened. In April 1764, 3 years after she had carried the king's first letter to Sarah, she eloped with O'Brien. The Fox Strangways family disowned her. She was sent with her husband to Quebec, where O'Brien took up a minor government post. She lived there in genteel exile for 7 years before returning to England. The 2 great elopements of the Lennox circle, Sarah's and Lady Susan's, ran in parallel. The 2 friends had carried letters for each other. They had, in the end, lived the same kind of life. Each had defied the family. Each had paid the price. What Sarah did next is the part of the story that the Goodwood guides do not always tell. On the 2nd of June 1762, less than 9 months after the coronation, she married Sir Charles Bunbury, a baronet and member of Parliament for Suffolk. The marriage was unhappy from the start. Bunbury was kind but uninterested. He preferred horses to his wife. Sarah, by all accounts, preferred almost anyone to her husband. In 1768, she began an affair with Lord William Gordon, brother of the 4th Duke of Gordon. On the 19th of February 1769, she eloped with him. She was 24. She left her husband. She left her household. She left the social world that had received her as the king's near queen and abandoned her as a Bunbury baronet's wife. She lived with Gordon for 2 years. She had a daughter by him. Gordon then left her. She returned to her family in disgrace. The Bunbury marriage was finally dissolved by Act of Parliament in 1776. It was one of the first parliamentary divorces obtained on the petition of a wife. The procedure was so unusual that the case is still cited in legal histories. On the 27th of August 1781, at the age of 36, Sarah married George Napier, a soldier of distinguished but obscure family. It was her 3rd marriage and her happiest. They had 8 children. 3 of their sons became generals in the Napoleonic Wars. Sarah lived to see her son, Charles Napier, become the conqueror of Sind in India. She died at her house in Wiltshire on the 26th of February, 1826, aged 81. The letter she had written on the 24th of September, 1761, was still in the Holland papers when she died. It is still there now. The Lennox family produced other scandals in the years between Sarah's coronation walk and her death. On the 26th of May, 1789, Charles Lennox, then a colonel, and the nephew of the 3rd Duke, fought a duel on Wimbledon Common against Frederick, Duke of York, the 2nd son of George III. The cause of the duel was a remark Lennox believed the Duke of York had spoken in the mess of the Coldstream Guards, where Lennox was a serving officer and the Duke of York was the colonel of the regiment. The remark, as Lennox understood it, had questioned his courage. He had heard it from a brother officer who had heard it from another brother officer who had been present in the mess. He demanded an explanation. The Duke of York refused. Lennox then placed a notice in the Daily Universal Register inviting any officer who had heard the remark to come forward. None did. The Duke of York continued to refuse to apologize. Lennox demanded satisfaction. They met at 7 in the morning on Wimbledon Common with pistols at 12 paces. The Duke of York's second was Lord Rawdon, later the 1st Marquess of Hastings. Lennox's second was the Earl of Winchilsea. They had agreed the conditions the previous evening at Winchilsea's house in St. James's Square. Lennox fired first. His shot took a button off the Duke of York's coat at the level of the chest. The button was found later by the seconds and was kept by Lord Rawdon as a memento. The Duke of York raised his pistol, then deliberately discharged it into the air. He would not, he said, return the fire of a man who had insulted him by demanding the duel. The seconds intervened. Both men withdrew. The duel was reported in every London newspaper by the next afternoon. It was the most discussed duel of the entire Regency period. The matter went before a court of inquiry of the Coldstream Guards. The court found that Lennox's conduct had been that of a man of honour, but that the duel had been irregular. He was advised to resign his commission in the Coldstream Guards. He did so within the week. He was then posted as Colonel of the 35th Regiment of Foot. Then stationed in Edinburgh, he served with the regiment for the next 8 years. He survived the disgrace. In 1806, he succeeded his uncle as the 4th Duke of Richmond, and 3 years later was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He brought to the dukedom a wife with a Caribbean inheritance. Charlotte Gordon, his duchess, was the daughter of the 4th Duke of Gordon. The Gordons held a sugar plantation in Tobago in the southern Caribbean. The plantation was worked by enslaved Africans. When the Slavery Abolition Act passed in 1833, the British government compensated slave owners for the loss of their human property. The Lennox-Gordon family claim, lodged in 1834, was for the freedom of 183 enslaved people on the Tobago plantation. The compensation paid was £15,750. The figure is recorded in the Slave Compensation Commission registers, now digitized by University College London. It is a part of the Goodwood story that the estate does not put on the visitor tour. It is part of the story all the same. The 4th Duke and his Duchess Charlotte were in Brussels on the 15th of June, 1815. The Duke had taken his family to the Low Countries the previous summer. partly to economise after his term as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and partly because his eldest son was serving on Wellington's staff and the Duke wished to be near him. They had taken a large house on the Rue de la Blanchisserie. The house had attached to it a converted coach house, used by the previous tenant as a warehouse, which the Duchess had had whitewashed and hung with crimson drapery and decorated with the regimental colours of every British regiment then serving in the army of the Low Countries. The room was, by any reasonable measure, the largest assembly room in Brussels in June 1815. The Duchess had brought a ballroom worth of London society with her into exile. On the night of the 15th, in that converted coach house in the Rue de la Blanchisserie, the Duchess held what would become the most famous ball in British military history. 228 guests attended. The full list, in the Duchess's own handwriting, is preserved in the Goodwood Estate Archive. The Duke of Wellington was there. Most of his staff officers were there. The Prince of Orange was there. Lord Uxbridge, who would lose a leg at Waterloo 3 days later, was there. The Earl of Hill was there. The young officers of the Foot Guards were there in their full-dress uniforms, having ridden in that afternoon from outlying quarters. The ball began at 9 in the evening. The musicians, drawn from the regimental bands of the 42nd Highlanders and the 92nd Gordon Highlanders, played country dances. The Highlanders themselves, by arrangement with the Duchess, performed a sword dance in the middle of the ballroom toward 11 o'clock. The dance was still in progress when the first despatch arrived. The despatch came from the Prince of Orange's headquarters. It reported that French cavalry had crossed the frontier from France into the Netherlands at Charleroi at first light that morning. The Prussian army was already engaged. Wellington's army was to march at dawn. Wellington read the despatch. He folded it. He continued the ball. He spoke quietly to his senior officers as the dancing continued. He did not announce the news. He did not leave until 2 in the morning. By 4, he was on the road to Quatre Bras. The ball broke up gradually as officers received their orders from Wellington's staff. Many of them left in their dancing pumps and full-dress uniforms and rode directly to their regiments. Many of the young officers who had danced at the Duchess of Richmond's ball were dead within 48 hours. The Duke of Brunswick was killed at Quatre Bras the following afternoon. Sir William Ponsonby was killed at Waterloo 3 days later. Wellington afterwards said he had never seen so many fine young men killed in so short a space of time. The ball became the central image of Waterloo in 19th century imagination. Byron wrote it into Childe Harold. Thackeray wrote it into Vanity Fair. Walter Scott, who visited the Rue de la Blanchisserie in 1816, wrote a long passage about it in Paul's letters to his kinsfolk. It is still, 2 centuries later, the most famous private party in British history. The coach house in the Rue de la Blanchisserie has long since been demolished. The Goodwood Archive holds the original guest list, the orchestra's bills, the Duchess's housekeeping accounts for the night, and a small piece of crimson drapery that was preserved by one of the guests and returned to the family in 1898. The third Duke, who had steered Sarah toward the king, had a different kind of scandal late in his life. In 1791, he was accused of doping horses at Newmarket. The Jockey Club, on investigation, found the charges credible. The third Duke was banned from racing at Newmarket. Rather than accept the ban, he established his own racing meet on the Sussex Downs above Goodwood. The first glorious Goodwood meeting was held in 1802. It became one of the most fashionable race weeks in the English calendar. It is still held every year on the same ground. In 1948, the 9th Duke, Freddie Richmond, opened a motor circuit on the disused airfield to the south of the house. The airfield had been built during the Second World War as a Royal Air Force fighter station, RAF West Hamptonette, a satellite of the Great Battle of Britain base at Tangmere. Spitfires of No. 145 Squadron had flown from the field in 1940. After the war, the perimeter track of the airfield had been left intact. The 9th Duke, who had been a serving officer in the Royal Air Force during the war and was an enthusiastic amateur racing driver, saw that the perimeter track formed a closed circuit roughly 2¼ miles in length. He proposed to use it for motor racing. The first race meeting was held on the 18th of September 1948. It was attended by 15,000 spectators. It was won by Sterling Moss, then aged 18. Goodwood Motor Circuit became one of the great post-war racing circuits in Britain. It hosted the Goodwood 9 Hours, the Tourist Trophy, the Glover Trophy, and a series of Formula One non-championship races. Drivers, including Juan Manuel Fangio, Mike Hawthorne, Graham Hill, and Jim Clark, raced at the circuit through the 1950s. In April 1959, the driver, Stuart Lewis Evans, had been fatally burned in a crash at Morocco the previous October. In April 1962, Sterling Moss himself was seriously injured in a crash at the circuit's St Mary's Corner. He never raced competitively again. The circuit's safety record had begun to look poor. In 1959, a driver had been killed in a sports car race. The 9th Duke, who had himself raced at the circuit, closed the track for competitive motor racing in 1966. It remained closed for 27 years. In 1993, the 10th Duke's son, Charles March, then heir apparent and now the 11th Duke, reopened the property for an annual historic motorsport festival. He had spent 2 years planning the event. He had restored the hill climb course that ran up the down behind the house. He had secured the participation of every major British motor manufacturer and a long list of historic racing drivers. He had budgeted carefully and had refused to allow the festival to begin until he was sure it could run at a profit. The first Festival of Speed was held in June 1993. It was attended by 25,000 spectators over 3 days. It made a small profit. The second, held in 1994, attracted 40,000. The third, held in 1995, attracted 60,000. By 1998, the festival was the largest motorsport event in Britain. It now draws 200,000 visitors a year and is broadcast in more than 50 countries. In 1998, the 11th Duke added the Goodwood Revival, a 3-day historic racing meeting on the original 1948 circuit. The circuit had been preserved in its 1959 layout. The Revival required all attendees to dress in period costume from the 1940s, 1950s, or 1960s. The cars were strictly limited to those of the period. The marshals wore the original Goodwood Marshals uniforms. The pit lane was decorated with the advertising hoardings of the period. The Revival is now considered the most successful historic motor racing event in the world. It draws 150,000 spectators over 3 days every September. That is the Lennox family. That is what they have made of 327 years on one piece of ground. Beneath the kings, and the jewels, and the ball before Waterloo ran another life entirely. It was the life of the servants who kept the house, the gardens, the stables, and the kitchens of Goodwood through every generation of the family upstairs. John Robinson was head groom at Goodwood between 1810 and 1840. He was 30 years old when he was appointed. He was 60 when he retired. He had begun in the stables as a boy of 12 under the 3rd Duke and had risen through the ranks of the stable yard for nearly 20 years before he was given the head groom's house at the bottom of the stable yard. He was responsible for 63 horses, the carriage stables, the hunting stables, and the breeding stock. He travelled with the 4th Duke and Duchess Charlotte to Brussels in 1815. He was at the Duchess's ball as a non-combatant attaché in the Duke's personal household. He was with the carriage horses on the night of the 15th of June 1815. When the despatch arrived, he saw the officers leave the ball. He took the carriage horses back to the stable in the early hours of the 16th. He survived the Waterloo campaign as a member of the Duke's personal staff. He returned to Goodwood in the autumn of 1815. He served the 4th Duke until the Duke's death in 1819 and continued in the same position under the 5th Duke. He retired in 1840 with a pension of £20 a year and a cottage in Charlton. He died at Chichester in 1851. Aged 71. His name appears in the estate wage book for 30 consecutive years. Sarah Druitt was chambermaid to Lady Sarah Lennox between 1755 and 1762. She had been engaged as a girl of 14 when Sarah was 10 in the Dublin household of Sarah's aunt. She followed Sarah to England in 1759. She was with Sarah at Holland House through the whole crisis of 1761. She was the servant who carried Sarah's letters to Lady Susan Fox Strangways and brought back the King's notes. She was the servant who dressed Sarah for the coronation on the morning of the 22nd of September 1761. She was the servant who saw Sarah return to Holland House that evening and sit alone in her bedroom for 2 hours before asking for a candle. She was the servant who saw the letter Sarah wrote the following afternoon and was instructed to carry it personally to Lady Susan's lodgings. She remained in Sarah's service for 9 months after the coronation. When Sarah married Sir Charles Bunbury in June 1762, Sarah's household was dissolved. Sarah Druitt was given £5 and a letter of reference. She left service the following month. Her later life is not recorded in the Goodwood papers. She had been with Sarah for 7 years and was by every indication the only person in the house who understood on the evening of the 22nd of September 1761 what the day had cost. Andrew Bell was head gardener at Goodwood between 1850 and 1880. He came from a family of Scottish gardeners and had trained at the Royal Caledonian Horticultural Society in Edinburgh before being engaged by the 5th Duke at the age of 28. He was responsible for the great cedar walk that runs from the south front of the house toward the racecourse, for the walled kitchen gardens, for the pleasure grounds, and for the trees in the park. He designed the planting of the cedar walk in the form it still has today. He trained 14 apprentice gardeners over his 30 years in the post. Most of them went on to be head gardeners at other Sussex estates. 2 became head gardeners at Petworth. 1 became head gardener at Arundel. 1 went to Highclere. He retired in 1880 at the age of 58. He died at Chichester in 1894. 3 names, 3 lives. None of them remembered in any history of Goodwood except in the wage books and in the estate's own quiet records. They were the people who made the house work. They were the people without whom no Duchess could have held a ball in Brussels and no Lady Sarah could have walked behind a queen at Westminster. The Goodwood wage books for the 18th and 19th centuries record the names of more than 3,000 servants who passed through the estate's employment. Most served for a year or 2 and moved on. A few, like Robinson and Bell, stayed for 30 years. A handful, like Sarah Druitt, were attached to a single member of the family and rose and fell with that member's fortunes. The estate has, in recent years, begun to digitise the wage books and to make them available to family historians through the West Sussex Record Office in Chichester. The slow work of restoring the names of the people who served at Goodwood is a project the present Duke has supported openly. There is talk of a permanent exhibition in the old stable yard. There is no firm date for its opening. The 11th Duke of Richmond inherited Goodwood in 2017. He was 62. He had been managing the estate, in effect, for 2 decades before his father's death. He had taken the Festival of Speed from a curiosity in 1993 to an institution drawing 200,000 visitors a year. He had launched the Goodwood Revival in 1998. He had developed the hotel, the golf courses, the aerodrome, and the estate offices. He had brought the annual turnover of the estate to £56 million. He had presided over a major restoration of the state apartments in the house. He had opened parts of the property to the public for guided tours between March and October each year. He had been the subject of a 2018 documentary, The Goodwood Estate, a family business, which followed a single year of the estate's operations through every department from the kennels to the boardroom. The estate now employs 740 people across all its operations. It runs the Goodwood Aerodrome, which is the busiest general aviation airfield on the south coast of England. It runs the Kennels Members Club, housed in the original Charlton Hunt Kennels, built by the first Duke in 1730. It runs 2 championship golf courses, the Downs Course and the Park Course. It runs the Goodwood Hotel, which has 91 bedrooms. It runs Glorious Goodwood every August. It runs the Festival of Speed every July. It runs the Revival every September. It runs an organic farm of 600 acres, which supplies the estate's restaurants. It runs a dairy herd, a beef herd, and a flock of 900 sheep. The Festival of Speed alone now generates a third of the estate's annual income. The Revival generates another quarter. Glorious Goodwood generates a sixth. The remaining quarter is divided between the hotel, the golf, the aerodrome, and the farm. The state apartments at Goodwood are open to the public for guided tours between March and October. Visitors enter through the Egyptian dining room with its Wedgwood basalt ware and its frieze of hieroglyphs commissioned by the third Duke after his trip up the Nile in 1764. They pass through the tapestry drawing room, hung with Gobelin tapestries given to the third Duke by Louis XV. They pass through the yellow drawing room, where the Reynolds portrait of Lady Sarah Lennox, at the age of 18, hangs above the fireplace. They pass through the long hall with its portraits of every Duke of Richmond since the first. They are not admitted to the family wing. They are not admitted to the muniment room, where the estate papers are kept. They are not admitted to the private library, where the documents most closely connected to the family's longer history are stored in glass cases. The bedroom, where Lady Sarah Lennox slept on her visits to Goodwood, is preserved with its 18th century panelling intact. The room is shown on the tour, but visitors are kept behind a velvet rope. Glorious Goodwood is still run on the same course laid out by the third Duke in 1802. The Festival of Speed runs every July. The Revival runs every September. The state apartments are open in summer. The cedar walk, planted by Andrew Bell in the 1850s, is still walked by visitors. The stable yard where John Robinson worked is now a courtyard for estate offices. The chambermaid's stair, Sarah Druitt, climbed at Holland House, is buried under the rubble of the 1940 Blitz. But the bedroom at Goodwood, where Sarah slept on her visits to her brother, is preserved with its 18th century panelling intact. The family still lives in the West Wing. The East Wing is open to the public. The flint walls are still grey and white in the Sussex light. There is a desk in the state apartments at Goodwood on which the 11th Duke is said to keep a copy, in transcription, of the letter Lady Sarah Lennox wrote to Lady Susan Fox Strangways on the 24th of September 1761. The original is in the British Library, in the Holland papers, in a box that is not on public display. The transcription on the desk reads, "I bore yesterday well enough. It is over. I shall not see him again." Sarah lived another 65 years after she wrote those lines. She married twice more. She raised 8 children. 3 of her sons became generals. She corresponded with 3 generations of the Holland House family. She lived through the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and the death of George III, and the accession of his son, and the accession of his second son. She was alive when Victoria was born. She knew, by the end of her life, that the king who had loved her in the spring of 1761 had gone mad and died blind in Windsor in 1820. She had outlived him by 6 years. She had outlived almost everyone she had known in the spring of 1761. Henry Fox had died in 1774. Lady Caroline had died only weeks after him. The third Duke of Richmond had died in 1806. Lady Susan Fox Strangways had died in 1827. Lord Bute had died in 1792. Princess Augusta had died in 1772. Queen Charlotte had died in 1818. Lord William Gordon had died in 1823. Sir Charles Bunbury had died in 1821. George Napier had died in 1804. Sarah herself, by the time she died at Burwood in 1826, was effectively the last living link between the court of George II and the court of George IV. She had been at Holland House when the news of Culloden arrived in 1746. She had been at Goodwood when the news of Trafalgar arrived in 1805. She had been at her son's house in Wiltshire when the news of Waterloo arrived in 1815. She had been an old woman when the future Queen Victoria was christened in 1819. She had outlived 3 George and was alive for the brief reign of a 4th. But the letter she wrote that September afternoon, when she was 16, and the king who had loved her was a married man, is the document her descendants have preserved most carefully. It is still in the British Library, in a box of Holland House papers, in a room the public cannot enter without an appointment. It has been read by no more than a few dozen scholars in 2 centuries. It has been quoted in 3 biographies. It has never been published in full. It sits in its acid-free folder in its temperature-controlled basement in a building on the Euston Road in London, 2 miles from the house in Kensington where it was written, and 70 miles from the house in Sussex from which Sarah Lennox had come. The British Library catalogue lists the box under a reference number known only to the staff of the manuscript's reading room. It has been requested by readers fewer than 50 times since the Holland papers were deposited there in 1972. The letter inside it is folded in three, written on a single sheet of laid paper, and signed in a hand the cataloguers describe as that of a young woman writing in haste. Sarah's signature on the letter is firm. There is no blot, no correction, no second thought. She wrote what she had to write, and she sealed it, and she sent it. It is still down there. It always will be.